Everybody, and welcome to the Free Press Book Club meeting for The Riveter by Jack Wang. My name is Erin Lebar. I am your book club administrator and also an audience engagement manager at the Free Press. We're joined tonight by Free Press Books editor Ben Sigurdson, co-owner of McNally Robinson, Chris Hall, and of course our author Jack Wang. Thank you so much for joining us.
Great to be here.
Just before we continue, I would like to acknowledge that the Free Press and McNally Robinson are located on Treaty 1 territory, the traditional land of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dene, and Dakota people, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. And Jack is actually joining us from Ithaca, New York. I think this is only our second U.S. author. I mean, you are a Canadian author, but living in the U.S., which is the traditional homeland of the Cayuga Nation, who are members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. The meeting will continue as it always does. Chris is going to do an introduction. Jack will do a reading, and then Ben will kick off the Q&A. I will mention that we got probably triple, maybe quadruple the amount of questions that we normally get pre-submitted. So we've kind of tried to break them up into topic categories, and we'll do our best to cover as much as we can in our short time together. So with that, I will throw it to Chris.
Great. Thank you, Erin. Hello, everybody. We're here tonight to discuss Josiah Chang's story, a man who trades his rivet gun in for a real gun. He's a national hero in the invasion of Normandy and the final push to end the war. But Josiah is not fighting for king and country, but rather for the love of poppy, and more broadly for the right to be recognized as a Canadian citizen, a right denied him despite his family having lived several generations in the country, and the right to marry Poppy such that she doesn't lose her citizenship by doing so. This is a Canadian war novel, and what a well-written Canadian war novel, but without the easy nationalism of most war novels. Josiah feels no great animus towards the Germans. In some ways, his fight was not against them, but against his own country. So the good guys and the bad guys, so often easy to differentiate in war novels. In this one, it's not so simple. It's a novel that prompts a number of interesting talking points. I'm looking forward to that discussion. As Erin points out, clearly you readers have some questions, so we've got all those lined up. Before we start that conversation, though, I will turn it over to Jack to read from The Riveter.
Thank you very much, Erin. Thank you, Chris. I'm going to read from chapter 4 of part 2 of The Riveter. And at this point in the novel, which doesn't move in a chronological way. At this point in the novel, Josiah Chang and the 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion have landed in Normandy. They've been in Normandy for about a day. No one has slept, and they've arrived at Le Mesnil Crossroads, where they're waiting for a German counterattack. So I will need my reading glasses for this. The first assault came at dawn. The world was just starting to reappear in staticky grays when they heard the whistling of mortars. Men who were standing hit the dirt. They had been taught that shrapnel shot upward, but these shells spewed their jagged fragments right along the ground. Men cried out. Some scrambled for cover, but the trenches were only half dug, of little solace when shells exploded midair and rained hot metal. Josiah lay with his face in the dirt, utterly pinned down. Those who weren't there can never truly know the chaos and the terror of moments like that. Dirt blown into your eyes, your mouth, your nose, the earth itself shaking you. And you, little you, hoping against hope that your luck will hold. When the pummeling slowed, Josiah looked up to see Sid Antoine dragging a man into the trench. Josiah followed suit, leaping out, grabbing another fallen man by the webbing and pulling him off the road. The man's right knee was unnaturally kinked, his trousers blooming darkly where shrapnel had torn clear through. The man gritted his teeth and snarled. As they waited for a medic, Josiah did his best to dress the man's wounds, to staunch the gouts of blood that flooded the holes in his knee like groundwater. All the while, they listened out for more whistling. They were on a ridge surrounded by rugged terrain, as well as flooded fields on one side, a half-moat, yet the enemy seemed to have all the advantage. As a child imagining medieval sieges, Josiah had always thought it better to be in the castle, arrowing from towers and parapets. Now he wasn't so sure. When the pounding resumed, the whistling of mortars was joined by a new sound, the thunderous reports of tanks. At the end of the sloping road, two panzers materialized, two mechanized beasts, trundling at a clip, and the sight was awesome. Awesome, yet irrational. They were flanked by infantry, a whole company it seemed, all in close formation on either side of the road. A full frontal assault with little room to maneuver. The Germans were sitting ducks. With no radio man nearby, a runner dashed back to headquarters. The Canadians had their own mortars by the brickworks, plus the 17-pounder. Sid and Josiah laid low, waiting for the salvo of their own artillery. The Germans were fast approaching, 500 yards, 400 yards, and lobbing deeper, aiming for the chimney, but there was no response. Had the runner been hit? Had their own guns been taken out? Were a few bedraggled paratroopers supposed to take on a whole German company? Come on, boys, come on, Sid muttered under his breath. Josiah mounted his Bren. The tanks were now so close he could see the Iron Cross, feel his heart swelling. At last, the deluge, a whomping cannonade followed by counter-whistling. Then the spectacular landings, earth thrown into the air, men. The first tank erupted into inferno, a direct hit from the 17-pounder, which must have had a clear view. The barrage continued. Germans slumped to the ground. Others seemed to vaporize in a cloud of blood. Once, when he was young, Josiah had swiped at a long thread of spider silk. He had expected the thread to swing down like a rope dropped at one end. Instead, the whole thread had vanished with a puff. It was like that. Josiah opened up into the screaming and shouting, the Germans walled in by hedgerows on either side. The second turret began to swivel, the black, cyclopic eye at the end of the barrel turning slowly in his direction, like a giant noticing an irritant behind him, before it too exploded out of existence. The world became a maelstrom of sound, of human misery. Then, almost as quickly, all that noise reverted to silence, save for the roaring of flames. I'll stop there.
That is an intense scene if there ever was one. Thank you so much, Jack. That was fantastic. And yeah, just throws you right into the action so intensely that yeah, it was just and there were so many different passages of that nature that absolutely were transfixing. Do you want to talk a little bit about how where the genesis of the book, I guess, for lack of a better term?
Sure, sure. So I actually started writing this book over 10 years ago now when I was on fellowship in England. This was in 2014, 2015. But the idea of this novel had lived with me for a long time before that. So long, in fact, sort of gestating for so long in my imagination that I can't really remember exactly the moment when the idea came to me, except that I knew for a long time I wanted to write about the exploits of Chinese Canadians during the Second World War. It could have been at one point watching a film called Unwanted Soldiers by Jari Osborne. It's an NFB film, and people can look it up online through the NFB, the National Film Board, when they have a moment. But it's about how Chinese Canadians during the Second World War were in fact unwanted. They were barred from the military in many respects, barred from conscription, barred from certain branches of the military, not allowed to volunteer in many provinces, and so on. But nonetheless, many eventually joined and served with distinction. And that was fascinating history to me, history that I hadn't learned as a student in Canada. And so I felt like it was a story that deserved to be more widely known.
And uh obviously, just an absolute boatload of research must have gone
Mhm.
into this
Yeah.
book. Where sort of it must have felt a little bit overwhelming in terms of, where to even start.
Yeah.
I know that you say in the acknowledgments that it's sort of, there was I can't remember the man's name now, a Chinese Canadian in the first Canadian Parachute
Right,
Battalion.
right,
Was
right.
that sort of a starting off or a jumping off? Sorry, no pun intended, a jumping off point for you in sort of pulling this story together?
Yeah, so the novel obviously now is called The Riveter, but at one point it was called The Riveters, plural, because I wanted to trace, the exploits of a number of Chinese Canadians because Chinese Canadians served in many theaters of war and all branches of the military. I had imagined, some going off to Europe and some going off to the Asian theater and some serving in the 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion, as Josiah does, others in Number 6 Bomber Command as other Chinese Canadians did. And ultimately, um, speaking of research, it just became like a sprawling project and a sprawling novel. And so at some point, I had to settle on one storyline, and the one that attracted me most was the one I had imagined of the person who was first a riveter in a riveting gang and then goes off to serve in the 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion. And he is inspired by a Chinese Canadian named Richard Marr, who was the only Chinese Canadian to serve in the 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion. And it might interest some folks out there if I shared my screen now, some photographs of Richard Marr to give you just a little sense of the man. And so, can everyone see the image of Richard Marr?
Yeah.
So I love this image of Richard Marr in front of the Union Jack. He looks so heroic to me in this particular image, and he hailed from British Columbia. There are different accounts, but he did. One account is that he was from Victoria. He did eventually, after the war, live in Vancouver. And this is another image of Richard Marr. And in this particular image, you can see that he's wearing the maroon beret. Well, you can't tell in black and white, but he's wearing the coveted maroon beret, which is the symbol of airborne everywhere. And he also has his wings emblazoned on his chest. Canadians had a patch when they earned their jump wings. Americans had a silver pin, but you can see that he has the parachute wings on his chest. And here's another image of Richard Marr, who, went to England. He didn't actually jump in Normandy, but he was part of the Ardennes offensive and jumped into Germany. And this is him at Camp Bulford in England. And so these are just a few images of Richard Marr. The important thing for me was that I wanted to create, he was the inspiration, but I didn't want to, write the life of Richard Marr. I wanted to create a story. I wanted to write an interracial relationship. I wanted to imagine my way into a totally different person, but he certainly was the inspiration for the idea of a Chinese Canadian serving in the 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion. And so in that sense, Josiah Chang is also a composite of other people. While Richard Marr may not have jumped into Normandy, many other Chinese Canadians served in the Normandy campaign. So he's kind of a composite of many Chinese Canadians.
Mm. Chris, you want to jump
Yeah,
in?
when you say that, that's interesting because we were saying beforehand, and then I was expecting a lot of interest in the research. That often the case in historical novels, myself included.
Mhm.
But then you say you don't want to just follow a real life person. What is it about fiction? Like what does that allow you to do with this story that following nonfiction, not so much literally, but like what does that allow for?
Yeah, very often the purpose of historical fiction is to sort of fill in gaps or lacuna in the historical record. And sometimes the historical record is very incomplete. And the task of the fiction writer, especially the historical fiction writers, to imagine one's way into those incomplete records. I read about Richard Marr in in a book called The Dragon in the Maple Leaf by Marjorie Wong. It's quite an exhaustive sort of compendium of the service of every Chinese Canadian in the First and Second World Wars. But because we're talking about hundreds of individuals, they're all very, very brief passages. So when I first read about Richard Marr, there wasn't very much about him. It's basically the outlines of a life, right? He's from Victoria. He, trained in got his jump wings in Fort Benning, Georgia, which is part of the novel. He served in the campaigns that I mentioned, and then it largely went on to talk about the general exploits of the 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion. And so the historical record was quite incomplete.
Mhm.
And of course, I could have looked more into Richard Marr, but I was interested in telling a particular story around an interracial relationship that would dramatize and symbolize the more complex relationship between Chinese Canadians and Canada at large. So, on the one hand, it is a particular relationship, but it is also a metaphor for the larger relationship between Chinese Canadians and the country they called home, and questions of faithfulness and fidelity and forgiveness and those kinds of questions. And so that I didn't think could be captured just by trying to do research on a real person, but to tell a fictionalized story.
Hmm. Well, that maybe leads nicely into sort of the outset of the story at the shipyard
Mhm.
where Joe meets Poppy and the character of Poppy, who I think a lot of people who read the book for our book club and otherwise, please don't tell me you can hear that cat. Anyway, sorry. Just about that character and how she's such a vivid and complex character. Was she inspired by, real women of the time that you may have come across in your research, or, were you, I mean, I imagine there was a little bit more flexibility there in terms of the character development as well.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, so, Poppy isn't based on a particular individual in quite the same way as Josiah is inspired by Richard Marr. But I think the first spark of her character came to me when I read a book about wartime shipbuilding, and I was doing research on shipyards. And I was reading about the strictures against women in shipyards. There was a lot of what you can only call segregation between men and women. There were a lot of rules about modesty, covering one's hair, and so on. But despite all of these rules and all these strictures, I read about a woman and a moment where a woman just emerges from behind a closed door in a shipyard, and a man follows soon after, and clearly they just did something indiscreet, something untoward. And the idea, of that kind of daring, despite social conventions, social mores, was fascinating to me and was maybe the first spark of her character. When I landed on the name Poppy, I really liked it because not only does the poppy symbolize service and, is therefore synonymous with the country itself, but it's a diminutive form of Penelope, who's probably the most famous character in literature to wait for somebody to come back from war in the Odyssey. But in Penelope's case, she's famous for her faithfulness. She's famous for being a certain kind of woman who just waits, right? Maybe it's not that simple. She's also got a lot of, cleverness and strategy of her own, but she's basically a faithful woman who waits. And I wanted to ask the question, well, is that maybe perhaps simplified kind of portrait of womanhood and female desire? Because the fact of the matter is, infidelity went up during the war for all the reasons you would expect, right? And so I wanted to write a different kind of character, a different kind of Penelope figure.
Mhm. Yeah, and in a sense, it's almost flipped on its head because Joe and Josiah and all of his traveling and it's, trudging around
Yeah,
Europe and as well as when he's in the U.S. training, I guess,
yeah,
has many opportunities to sort of
yeah,
sow his wild oats for lack of a better
yeah.
term. And yet doesn't do so, and then return, when he does eventually return from the war, finds out that the same can't be said for Poppy. And I think that that was quite a moving development in the story, and a really moving passage when that happened.
Yeah, he has Josiah has a certain kind of moral rectitude, and he's different than Odysseus, who is in fact sleeping with all kinds of women in the Odyssey. So it is a kind of reversal, as you suggest, and not that he isn't tempted, not that Josiah isn't tempted, not that Josiah is perfect or not human, but he tries very hard to maintain this sense of moral, rectitude,
Hmm.
and so it is a little bit of a reversal, yeah.
Hmm. And one question from a reader, talks about sort of Poppy's ease with sexual encounters versus maybe Jimmy's or sorry, Joe's lack of ease with that, and the discomfort sort of that he ends up feeling, and the sort of asked about his own personal belief in faithfulness, fidelity, loyalty, and I would add maybe sort of how that all fits in as well to his thoughts on on Canada as a country, I guess.
Right. Yeah. As I was, had begun to suggest earlier, on the one hand, this is a flesh and blood relationship between two people. And, the very thing that attracts Josiah to Poppy, which is her sexual openness, right? And her sense of sexual freedom is also something that challenges him when he chooses to go off to war despite her wishes, right? And so, in a very flesh and blood way, these are two people who have different sexual values and they're trying to negotiate them in the context of war and separation. But as I suggested, Poppy also symbolizes the nation state and that feeling that many Chinese Canadians felt that they had been betrayed in different ways by their country. For example, on Canada Day, then known as Dominion Day, 1923, the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed. Most Canadians know this history, and Chinese Canadians referred to it as Humiliation Day because it was a humiliation to be the only people barred from immigrating to Canada on the basis of nationality. And between the passage of that act and the time it was repealed in 1948, when the Canadian Citizenship Act was passed, some research has suggested only 8 people of Chinese descent were allowed into Canada, during that period. And so, this whole idea of loving one's country despite these kinds of betrayals and humiliations and, lack of fidelity, is suggested in their relationship. So that's what I'm trying to suggest is that the challenges of reconciling with Poppy are the challenges in some ways of Chinese Canadians reconciling with the country they love.
Chris?
Sure.
Sorry.
I wasn't very far into the novel before started to see some similarities between um, Josiah and because he's Chinese and
Mhm.
indigenous people and
Mhm.
indigenous fellows who signed up for the war,
Right.
and then we get introduced to Sid Antoine, which I thought
Mhm.
was his presence in the novel adds so much. What are the similarities, I guess, in the experiences of those two groups of people?
Yeah, I mean, I think I tried in this novel to make connections between different groups who are seeking, you know, um, different kinds of freedoms and a sense of their full humanity. So that includes Aboriginal Canadians who served in, all branches of the military, including the 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion. The novel, when it goes to the American South and it goes to Fort Benning, it also tries to connect to African Americans and the experience of African Americans who are seeking what was called double victory, victory at home, or victory abroad and victory at home, right? Also trying to connect to, women's liberation and women like Poppy who were trying to, right, break the chains of social convention and the limits on their freedoms. The war, of course, was a great opening for women in terms of being allowed into the workforce and allowed into traditionally male realms, and that came to a fairly abrupt end after the war came to a conclusion. And so I tried to draw connections. And I think Sid Antoine was, on the one hand, an effort to amplify those kinds of connections. I haven't seen a lot of narratives where there, Canadians of Chinese descent and Canadians of Aboriginal descent who form these kinds of friendships. I think it was also a way of saying, because there are also Black Canadians in the 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion in the novel, that the 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion was, in many ways, a multiracial coalition of Canadians who went and fought. Obviously not as diverse as Canada is now, but nonetheless, it was a multiracial um, coalition. It was interesting to me that after writing the novel, I learned that Richard Marr was actually biracial and is also of South Asian descent. And so those of South Asian descent can also claim Richard Marr as, someone who, represented them in during the Second World War. And so for, those and other reasons, I wanted um, a character like Sid Antoine. I felt it was important.
Hmm.
Um, Another character, well, how do I put this? One character that shows up at Fort Benning unexpectedly is Joe's father, who
Mhm.
appears when he's training to do his jumps, and I was fascinated with the appearance and role of the characters that sort of haunt
Mhm.
Josiah and sort of come in and out of his life. His father when he's learning to jump. There's the dog around this same time that the dog goes missing in Vancouver in BC, and then
Yeah.
there's the soldiers that appear at the foot of his bed,
Yeah.
the soldiers that he has killed,
Right.
most of them at least. Yeah, can you talk a little bit about those spirits, sort of what it was like to write them, what they kind of represent as well?
Right. Yeah, yeah, that's a great question. And I'm going to try to tie it into something that I've heard from other readers, and that is that Josiah isn't a particularly religious person. And in fact, he takes quite a materialist view of life, and he doesn't believe in God, and he thinks, that the world is material. Um, and I think some people take Josiah's view as the book's view. It may or may not be the book's view. It certainly is Josiah's view. But despite this materialist view, he has these encounters that could challenge that strictly materialist view of the world. And I do something similar in a short story called The Nature of Things, which appeared in my first book, We Two Alone. In that case, it's different. It's a character who's a believer, actually Christian, and her husband is not, and then her views are complicated in sort of the other direction. But some of these encounters where he seems to be encountering the spiritual realm, it's partly, I think, a reflection of his Chineseness and the belief that traditional Chinese culture has had in ghosts, and how largely they very often figure in you know traditional Chinese society. And but it could also, of course, these could be coincidences and figments of his imagination, right, and unconscious projections. We don't know, and this in the novel doesn't necessarily seek to answer the question, right,
Mhm.
but to problematize to some degree Josiah's materialist beliefs about the world.
Yeah.
They
Uh,
also, of course, simply mirror his this simply reflects something about his psychological state, right? Whether it's guilt about his father and whether or Queenie in the case of the dog, or even his guilt about the Germans that he's killed, as you know alluded to earlier, he doesn't necessarily see the Germans as his enemy. He's not just out there to kill Germans, and he feels guilty about those he's killed in the course of duty. So these are all, reflections of his psychology as well, of course.
I wondered because that you have a passage when they are getting on the plane to go
Mhm.
over to be dropped,
Yeah,
and you describe the men's need to feel seen, to feel watched and loved.
yeah,
Some men called that God.
right.
For Josiah, however, the watcher was someone else, and it was to that someone else that he prayed. And that gave me a real sense that there's something more spiritual to this guy than I wondered. And I mean that I certainly thought of his father there, but I did wonder about his grandfather and his great grandfather
Hmm. Hmm.
and kind of the ancestor aspect
Yeah.
of Eastern thought too. That I thought was a real insightful couple of lines about Josiah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, sometimes people or take the view that if you're not religious, you're also not spiritual. And I think I'm trying to suggest that one can perhaps not believe in a monotheistic God and still have a spiritual view of life. And he has a kind of almost a mysticism, especially when he burns, the joss paper and he's honoring his father and his ancestors, as you suggest. That was actually in response to some feedback I got from my wife when she suggested that, remember Josiah is fourth generation Canadian and he's pretty thoroughly Canadian. And his initials, JC, are actually meant to allude to Johnny Canuck. Like Johnny Canuck, he's a lumberjack, comes from the north. He's a soldier and he's a figure of Canadian, and of course, and he's thoroughly Canadian, and Josiah is too. And at one point, my wife said to me, "Well, he is thoroughly assimilated, but um, it would be nice if there were something that also reflected his Chineseness a little bit more." And that's when I thought more about the joss paper and remembering very vividly watching my own grandmother burning joss paper for my grandfather and so on and so forth. And that really stayed with me. And I could see how that would also stay with Josiah, even though he, um, like myself, is quite assimilated as a Canadian and as a Westerner.
One reader did ask, what has been the response from the Chinese Canadian community who you've spoken to who have read
Mhm.
this book?
Yeah. Well, I had the good fortune of doing a couple events in Vancouver this summer when I went to visit my family. One of them was at the Chinatown Storytelling Center, and a number of people who asked questions at the end stood up and talked about their father's service or their uncle's service during the Second World War. And this is a story that's very close to many people. It's not just something in the history books, but something very, very close to their families and very, very close to, you know, um, the sense of, you know, pride that people have in being Chinese Canadian. And very close, of course, to the freedoms that all of us enjoy now, right? As Canadians, as the sacrifices of all of who served in the Second World War, including Chinese Canadians. I think the response has been positive. People um, have been happy to see their stories reflected in the novel. And yeah, I guess my point is just that it's not just academic for some people. It is lived experience, and it's very close and
Mhm.
important to many people.
Were you able to, another reader question, were you able to speak with any anyone who served, any Chinese Canadians who served or otherwise
Mhm.
in the research or to lead up to this book?
Yeah, that's a good question. So at one point, when I did imagine that the story was going to be called The Riveters, and I had imagined people going off to many theaters of war, I was interested in something called Special Operations Executive. And for those who don't know, Special Operations Executive was a civilian authority started by Churchill himself to foment resistance behind enemy lines, primarily in Europe. So we know, of course, in Nazi-occupied Europe, there was all kinds of resistance, right, in every occupied country. But eventually, Special Operations Executive became operational in Asia as well. And the irony is that after barring Chinese Canadians, people asked, well, who would make good secret agents in Asia? Who could pass as native, who could speak the language? And they realized Chinese Canadians fit the bill, right? And so they started recruiting Chinese Canadians into something called Force 136. Actually, a couple hundred Chinese Canadians from the army. But there was an original cohort of 13 that were trained at Goose Bay, now called Commando Bay in British Columbia. And one of those people was Hank Wang. And I did speak to him, and uh, uh, he was living, I believe, at the time in Toronto, and I did talk to him on the phone. The reality is, by the time I got around to writing this novel, most of the Chinese Canadian veterans were either gone or very elderly. Eventually, I tried to call back, and his son said he was no longer interested in talking to anyone about his war experiences. And for good reason. I think he'd been talking for a long time, and I think he just wanted to be at peace at that point, and I didn't blame him. So, but one book that was very useful, I want to give credit to, is Boys of the Clouds, and it was just an oral history of people who served in the 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion. And so to hear those firsthand accounts of being in the 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion gave me, many authenticating details, gave me many scenarios to imagine my way into. And those firsthand accounts are definitely perhaps one of the most valuable, maybe the most valuable form of research, just to hear the soldiers who were there talking about their experiences.
Mhm. Were you able to go to Fort Benning, or sort of did you in your research were able to sort of follow the path that the 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion would have taken through Europe into Germany?
Yeah, so I didn't actually do a pilgrimage per se,
Mhm,
but
mhm.
I've been to many of the places that I write about. I grew up in Vancouver. I was an undergraduate at the University of Toronto, and I lived in England a couple of occasions, including, as I mentioned, on fellowship at the University of East Anglia in 2014-15. At that point, I was writing the novel, so I was doing research while I was there, digging through the National Archives on a subsequent trip. Interestingly, because Churchill started Special Operations Executive, a lot of stuff about Chinese Canadians who served, resides at the National Archives in London.
Hmm.
But I did go to Fort Benning. As it happens, my in-laws live in the panhandle of Florida. So one time when I was down there, I drove up to Fort Benning, and unlike the jump tower in Camp Shiloh, which is no longer there, the jump towers in Fort Benning remain there from the Second World War, and I got to see the jump towers as they largely would have stood during the Second World War. And I saw American paratroopers coming down something called the Mock Tower, a 35-foot jump tower where they simulate landings by sliding down a cable. They still train in largely similar ways, including coming off those 250-foot jump towers. And I also went to the National Infantry Museum in Columbus, Georgia, which is not far away. And there they have something called Company Street, which is a reconstruction of a World War II street using the actual barracks and mess halls and churches and some actual buildings from that era. So when I describe Fort Benning and and the barracks and what it was like to live in them, and the row of unpartitioned toilets and the single shower stall for all the men in a single barrack, that's because I walked through a barrack and saw for myself.
That's very cool. Sorry, I didn't mean to put you on the spot there.
No, no,
That,
no.
that,
As it
that,
happens, I went to Fort Benning, Georgia.
well, there you go. Oh, that's
Yeah.
very cool. And we did have one. I think I know the answer to this one, but there was one question. Have you ever parachuted?
Yeah. Well, as I like to joke, I wanted to make sure I finished the novel. So I did not jump out of a plane. That's one bit of research that I
Smart,
could
smart.
have, but did not do. Also, I'm not too sure my wife would let me, but
No. Well, I mean,
I,
it's a fair question. I mean, I wouldn't ask, for talking to someone who had written a murder mystery,
yeah,
have you
yeah, right.
ever murdered someone?
Yeah.
But yeah, anyway, Chris, do you have anything after that?
Sure. Well, why don't we take it back to Josiah? He joins up, I guess. He wants to join up because he almost wants to force Canada to accept
Yeah.
him.
Yeah.
And he is kind of discouraged by that in a few occasions, including quite directly from the black fellow he meets in the club in the
Yeah.
U.S. that
Yeah.
he's wasting his time. What would you say is the assessment? What did people like Josiah, did they contribute something? Was there hope that they generated by making this sacrifice?
Yeah, so at the time of the Second World War, the Chinese Canadian community was divided, as it were, about the question of service. Some people felt this was a real opportunity. Some people felt like this was the chance for Chinese Canadians to prove themselves, to prove their loyalty, to prove their worth, right? To serve the country, earn citizenship in the franchise. And half the community, as it were, embraced this as a possibility. And then, understandably, there were others who were like, "No, why should I serve a country that doesn't want me? Why should I lay my life on the line, right, for a country that doesn't recognize not just me as a citizen, but my full humanity?" And so the community was quite divided. Josiah Chang happens to be a person who's always been quite able, and he wants to join the 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion because he thinks of himself as the best of the best, right? But I think that within his attitude, there's a critique because very often immigrants and refugees as well, there's this kind of expectation of exceptionalism to belong and to be admitted and to be accepted in society. You have to be exceptional, right? And Josiah sort of buys into this idea of exceptionalism. I'm going to prove myself. I am better than other guys. I'm going to be exceptional. But we have to step back and ask, why does every immigrant or refugee have to prove themselves in this way as exceptional? When clearly that's not always the case with everyone else in the right society, that they have to be exceptional in order to belong. And so Poppy, for example, that's another tension. It's not just about their relationship or fidelity. Poppy doesn't like the idea of him having to sacrifice in this way and to risk his life in this way. And she thinks it's a terrible bargain. And the way she puts it, of course, is like, prove yourself and we'll let you be human. She doesn't want him to take the bargain. And that's part of the tension in their relationship as well, is they just disagree fundamentally about whether or not he should serve. It's
Mm.
not just about absence and separation. She doesn't like that. She just doesn't like this bargain. And I think there's an argument to be made, right? This is
Mm.
not a good, this is not a good deal. That certain groups of people always have to prove themselves as human before they're allowed to be human or fully human. And so, I think Josiah is in the camp, as it were, that wants to prove himself, and Poppy. So in a way, they kind of represent the two camps in the Chinese Canadian community, one that is for this moment and those who are uncertain and even opposed to this moment.
Mm.
Yeah, we did a couple people sort of mention the ending. When readers turn the final page, here's one question. When readers turn the final page, because I know we're sort of getting close to having to wrap up here. Aaron nods. When readers turn the final page, what lasting insight or feeling do you hope they come away with or walk away with?
Yeah. Well, frankly, I love it when people tell me that they cried at the end. I hope people feel moved. I hope people are rooting for these people and feel invested enough to care about how their relationship turns out up until the very final moments of the novel. The novel ends shortly after the war, before 1948, before the repeal of the Chinese Exclusion Act, before the Canadian Citizenship Act was passed. And let's try to remember that before 1948, there wasn't Canadian citizenship per se. We were British subjects. Those who had citizenship were British subjects. And he doesn't have the franchise yet. He's actually asked the Premier of British Columbia if he can vote, and the answer is no. So on the one hand, there's this kind of downbeat. He's served, he's risked his life, he's gone on this odyssey, and it seems like he's lost everything, right? And so, without giving away the ending, I would just say that um, you know, there's also, of course, we also know how the story turns out for Canada, right? We also know how it turns out for Chinese Canadians. So I'm trying to walk that line between both the sense of loss and the pain, but also that brighter future that we know is ultimately coming for Chinese Canadians and others.
Got
No,
a question from the live chat that might actually be a good way to kind of wrap up a little bit. So someone's asking, I'd love to hear more about what a typical day looks like for you, especially how you find inspiration and approach the writing process kind of outside of the Riveter's like specific research. Like what does a day in the life look like for you?
Okay. Great question. So when I'm in the thick of things, when I'm in the throes of writing, I can be very, very disciplined and almost masochistic in my discipline. I can wake up first thing in the morning, go into my writer's garret, which is actually my office is actually a converted walk-in closet, so it's a windowless room. I'm literally can't, look out at the rest of the world, and I'm super focused, and I can spend all day in there, much to the chagrin of my wife and kids. But right now, I'm in a different phase. Hajin has a poem, and it's called Missed Time. And it's about the time that a writer misses when they're writing all the time. And there are a couple of lines that go, nothing is better than to lead a storyless life that requires no writing for meaning. And that's the phase I'm in right now. I'm trying not to build my life just on writing. My older daughter is a senior in high school. She's going to leave the house soon, and I've already had enough missed time. And so my life right now is trying to enjoy the interim between projects to focus on my family. So it's very I guess it can be a very schizophrenic sort of life. Sometimes it's super intense, and other times I'm just trying to take it all in.
And you're also
well,
working as a professor as well, right?
That's right. I teach at Ithaca College in Ithaca, New York, and that's my day job. And as I mentioned, Erin, today was the first day of classes. So yeah, it keeps me busy.
Well,
we won't.
I'll
Oh, sorry.
sorry. I was going to say, as readers, we can be a bit selfish though, because
Yeah.
we're really looking forward to your
Yeah,
next one.
I'm gonna try. I'm gonna
Yeah.
try.
Well, don't make it take 10 years next time. No,
Okay.
I'm just joking. It sounds like you've got the work ethic to make it happen quicker, but we will not keep you from your family any longer. You've had a full day of classes and now this, and we so appreciate your time, Jack. I can't speak on behalf of all readers, but I thoroughly enjoyed this book. It was just once I picked it up, it was hard to put down, and I think the number of questions that we got from viewers and book club members really reflects just how invested people are and were in this book. So thank you again so much for taking the time.
Mhm.
Well, thank you very much. It's been an absolute delight. I want to thank all of the, readers out there for posing their questions, everyone watching for joining. I also want to say that I visited Winnipeg when I was in the 10th grade for the Canada-wide Science Fair. So I've been to your neck of the woods and can't wait for a chance to go back.
Well,
Well,
thank you so much.
you got to go
Well,
see Chris at McNally
that's
and
right.
Yeah, for
Well,
sure.
we'll have you for an event for your next book.
great bookstore.
Do it. Let's do it.
Good.
Just before we go, I want to mention that our next book is 52 Ways to Reconcile by the amazing David A. Robertson. David has been, this is going to be a three-peat for him with the book club. Only author I think that we've had three times. But
And then he's banned.
then he's done. We're cutting him off. But our meeting falls on September 30th, which is the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. So we thought we should do our part. And that's only one of the reasons why we chose this book. So we will be meeting on September 30th. David will be joining us, and I hope we can have a really thoughtful discussion about all of the recommendations he makes in this book. And that's it for us. Thank you again to Chris and Ben, of course, Jack, for your time. And then we will see you again in September. Bye, everybody.
Bye.